Section 2. By retreating from the political plane, the theoretical outlook of orthodox Marxism is visible. A commitment to science pervades this outline. An esteem for science is hardly unique to Marxism. An esteem for science infuses modern society. Science guarantees success. Marxism inherited this proposition from bourgeois society and hammered it into a deadly poison. For Marxists, it became the revolver to shoot dissidents and opponents. The primal and final charge that orthodox Marxism invokes is that their opponents have violated the canons of science. They are pre-scientific, non-scientific, literary, romantic, utopian, historicist, humanist, aesthetic. Christ. Sorry, gotta copy that down. Marx also considered his work scientific and contrasted it to utopian and other brands of socialism. Quote, "There is no royal road to science," end quote. Marx cautioned his French readers of Capital. Yet Marx employed the term science sparingly and criticized the term science's excessive usage. More importantly for Marx, science means, quote, Wissenschaft, a term that resounds with Hegel. That the English and French, quote, science is more limited than the German, quote, Wissenschaft is a point regularly made in cultural and intellectual studies. Footnote, one example, Walter Kaufmann's Hegel, a reinterpretation published in 1966. I'm going to look this book up. The description for this book says, the continuing discovery of important Hegel manuscripts and advances in the criticism of Hegel's works have set the stage for a major re-evaluation of one of the greatest philosophers of all time. This volume constitutes the comprehensive reinterpretation of Hegel that has long been needed. The first chapters are devoted to the influences of other German philosophers on Hegel, his early publication as they are relevant to his later writings, and his phenomenology in itself, and as a key to understanding his terminology and dialectic. Examined next are the further elaboration of his thought in logic, his famous system, as presented in various editions of the encyclopedia, and his little-known views on history. A final chapter details in letters and contemporary reports Hegel's intellectual development. Back to the text. The transition from a Hegelian notion of science to a positivist notion of science is developed in Herbert Schendelbach, Erfahrung, Begründung und Reflexion. I'll look this up. Yeah, I don't think I'm seeing any description of this. Yeah. Sorry about that. Continue on. See also the classic work of Edmund Husserl, The Crisis of European Sciences. Wikipedia says, The Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology, An Introduction to Phenomenological Philosophy, is an unfinished 1936 book by the German philosopher Edmund Husserl. The work was influential and is considered the culmination of Husserl's thought though it has been seen as a departure from Husserl's earlier work. The work is divided into three main sections. Part 1, The Crisis of the Sciences as expression of the radical life crisis of European humanity. Part 2, Clarification of the origin of the modern opposition between physicalist objectivism and transcendental subjectivism. And Part 3, The Clarification of the transcendental problem and the related function of psychology. In Part 1, Husserl discusses what he considers a crisis of science, while in Part 2, Husserl discusses the astronomer Galileo Galilei and introduces the concept of the life world. The Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology was first published by Martinus Niehoff Publishers in 1954. A second printing followed in 1962. An English translation by David Carr was published by Northwestern University Press in 1970. The Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology is Husserl's most influential work, according to the philosopher Ante Paginen. It was also the most influential philosophical work of its time. Husserl's discussion of Galileo is famous. The work is considered the culmination of Husserl's thought. It has been compared to Hegel's The Phenomenology of Spirit by the philosophers Maurice Nathanson and Michael Inwood, and described as a, quote, great work. Nathanson argued that Husserl's views can be compared to those of the novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky, despite the differences between the two. Michael Inwood argued that in the Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology, Husserl adopted a philosophical approach that differed from the one he had employed in earlier works, such as Ideas, published in 1913, and Cartesian Meditations, published in 1931. In Michael Inwood's view, the work brought into question Husserl's attempt to found a rigorous science that would be free from all preconceptions. Inwood noted that some philosophers, including Maurice Merleau-Ponty, considered it a significant departure from Husserl's earlier work. Carr described the work as important, while R. Philip Buckley maintained that the Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology's themes continue to be relevant to contemporary philosophy. Buckley credited Husserl with providing a powerful, quote, critique of the development of modern science, end quote. However, he suggested that the book's history makes it clear that Husserl found it a struggle to, quote, give clearer expression to his ideas and to unify them into a coherent whole, end quote. While working on it, Buckley noted that Husserl was dissatisfied with Part 3 of the work and wanted to revise it. He also argued that the work left some problems unresolved, including the question of how the decay of philosophy and science has made the existence of that decay apparent. Dan R. Stiver maintained that because the Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology is unfinished, its interpretation is, quote, notoriously difficult, end quote. Stiver maintained that in the Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology, Husserl adopted views that placed his belief in the possibility of basing philosophy on the, quote, direct givenness to intuition of what is experienced, end quote, under severe strain. He argued that while one of Husserl's comments has been seen as expressing his awareness of the failure of phenomenology, it was more likely that Husserl wanted to recognize that, quote, what had been a burgeoning program attracting many disciples had fallen to the wayside with its founder, having been overtaken by other philosophical movements, end quote. The philosopher Richard Velkley, or Richard Velkley, I don't know if he's German or English or... No, he's American, so it's Richard Velkley, considered Husserl's reflections on the life world to be among the, quote, most striking and fundamental, end quote, of the new concerns that Husserl developed in response to his awareness of a contemporary moral and political crisis. However, He considered details of Husserl's account of science open to question. The philosopher Roger Scruton used Husserl's concept of the life world to explore the nature of human sexuality. Roger Scruton maintained that Husserl correctly recognized that the life world is given intersubjectively, but that the, quote, transcendental psychology, end quote, Husserl adopted in association with the idea of its intersubjectivity is flawed. The economist Peter Galbash wrote that some research has utilized the work to show how other disciplines, such as mainstream economics, shared the crisis of modern sciences. Thank you for allowing me that detour. End footnote. For the history of Marxism, however, it merits more attention than a footnote. Sorry, let me read the last sentence I read. That the English and French, quote, science is more limited than the German, quote, Wissenschaft is a point regularly made in cultural and intellectual studies. For the history of Marxism, however, the distinction between English and French science and German Wissenschaft merits more attention than a footnote, since it involves the entire question of Hegel's impact on Marxism. If Marx deemed his own work scientific, he distrusted a religion of science. Footnote, see Paul Thomas, Marx and Science, Political Studies, Marx and Science, published in Political Studies, 1976. End footnote. On more than one occasion, Marx dissociated himself from the term scientific socialism. Marx charged Proudhon with fetishizing science. Quote, no school of thought has thrown around the word, quote, science more haphazardly than that of Proudhon, ... end quote. Marx, Capital, page 161. Marx employs the term, quote, science, not, quote, Wissenschaft. End footnote. For Proudhon, science, quote, reduces science's self to a slender proportion of a scientific formula. Proudhon is the man in search of formulas, end quote. Marx, The Poverty of Philosophy. The term in the original French text is again science. End footnote. Years later, responding to Bakunin's accusation that, quote, scientific socialism, end quote, wissenschaftlicher Sozialismus was elitist, Marx clarified, quote, scientific socialism, end quote, was only used in opposition to utopian socialism, which wants to attach the people to new delusions, instead of limiting its science to the knowledge of the social movement made by the people itself, end quote. Marx, Conspectus of Bakunin's Statism and Anarchy, published in First International and After. End footnote. The science here meant knowledge of the, quote, social movement made by the people itself, end quote. Erkenntnis der vom Volk selbst gemachten sozialen Bewegung, end quote, suggests the divergence between the Hegelian, quote, Wissenschaft, end quote, and the French and English, quote, science. This can be overstated, but the terms illuminate and ultimately sustain two conflicting Marxist approaches to history and society. The distinction between, quote, Wissenschaft and science only gains currency outside the natural and exact sciences. This already structures the problem. For the issue was how to transfer the methods of the natural sciences to the social, political, and philosophical terrain. By virtue of the palpable advances of the natural sciences, this was a compelling project. In duplicating the methods of the natural sciences, the hope was to duplicate its achievements. This project inspired a myriad of thinkers from Auguste Comte to Emile Durkheim, Karl Popper, and contemporary sociologists, and forms the nub and hub of positivist, non-Hegelian science. The history of these efforts is neither simple nor monotonous, and it is cluttered with reservations and qualifications. Footnote: the term, quote, positivism poses many problems. There is little agreement on positivism's definition. Some would restrict positivism to Comte and his direct followers. See W.M. Simon, European Positivism in the 19th Century. I don't think I'm seeing any description for this book. Yet, the Vienna Circle, with few or no links to Comte, adopted the term logical positivism. See A.J. Ayer's Introduction to Logical Positivism, published 1959. The description for logical positivism by A.J. Ayer says, featuring a detailed introduction from Professor A.J. Ayer, the concepts and main ideas of logical positivism and its revolutionary theories, and explained and discussed in this bibliography featuring several classic papers in English for the first time. Edited by A.J. Ayer, logical positivism offers, in the words of the movement's founders, revolutionary theories on meaning and metaphysics, the nature of logic and mathematics, the foundations of knowledge, the content of psychological propositions, ethics, sociology, and the nature of philosophy itself. In the pages of this book, readers will find classic papers by Schlick, Carnap, and Neurath, and Hahn, published for the first time in English. In the most complete bibliography on the subject, logical positivism explains the movement's main ideas and their impact on contemporary philosophy in Britain and the United States. Back to the text. See in the same volume, Positivism and Realism by Moritz Schlick. See Gustav Bergmann's The Metaphysics of Logical Positivism. Let's look this up. I'm not seeing any descriptions of this book. Back to the text. Others, such as Popper, who might be situated within the history of positivism, reject the term. See Popper's Reason or Revolution in Theodore W. Adorno et al.'s The Positivist Dispute in German Sociology, published in 1976. In English in 1976, at least. I'm going to read the Wikipedia for the Positivism Dispute. The Positivism Dispute was a politico-philosophical dispute between the critical rationalist Karl Popper, Hans Albert, and the Frankfurt School, Theodor Adorno, Jürgen Habermas in 1961. About the methodology of the social sciences, it grew into a broad discussion within German sociology from 1961 to 1969. The naming itself is controversial since it was the Frankfurt School proponents who accused the critical rationalists of being positivists, while the latter considered themselves to be opponents of positivism. I'm not going to read the whole debate, Wikipedia, just wanted to Well, touch on that. Yet what Popper himself presents as this back to the text. Yet what Popper himself presents as the substance of his agreement with the Vienna Circle suffices to include Popper within the currents of positivism. Quote, I still feel very much at one with the Vienna Circle, end quote. And Popper mentions in particular the distinction Carnap drew between, quote, the way mathematicians and scientists proceed, end quote, and the, quote, depressing ways of the philosophers, end quote. See Karl Popper, Unended Quest, published 1976. According to Wikipedia, Unended Quest, an intellectual autobiography, is a 1976 book by the philosopher Karl Popper. The first work appeared with the title Autobiography of Karl Popper in The Philosophy of Karl Popper, published 1974, from the Library of Living Philosophers series. The book chronicles Popper's life from the beginning, including wider implications Popper drew from his experiences. In Chapter 1, Omniscience and Fallibility, for example, he describes his apprenticeship to a cabinet maker while he was a university student. His master invited him to ask anything he liked because, with due modesty, the master claimed to know everything. Popper writes that he became a disciple of Socrates and learned more about the theory of knowledge, including how little he knew, and his, quote, omniscient master, end quote, than from his university teachers. Other thematic chapter subjects include music, education, and philosophical problems Popper encountered, and his differences from other philosophers, whether early or contemporary. These are woven into an account of events in his life and research programs that he developed. For example, Chapter 24 discusses two of his best-known works, The Open Society and Its Enemies, and The Poverty of Historicism, and the origins of, quote, critical rationalism, to describe the approach he espoused. Back to the text. This seems to confirm Albrecht Velmer. Quote, Popper's criterion features the tendency proper to the positivist theory of science, that is, the intention to make scientific empiricism the unique, consciously applied law of scientific research, end quote. Albrecht Velmer. C. Velmer, Critical Theory of Society, published 1971. There's like a very brief description here. It says, the Frankfurt School social philosopher attacks the positivistic aspects of Marxist philosophy as well as providing a critique of bourgeois science and philosophy. Won't say anything more than that. Back to the text. For a more sympathetic account of Popper, see Gerald Radnitsky, Contemporary Schools of Metascience. Yeah, I'm not really seeing any good descriptions of this book. Back to the text. In general, I follow Leszek Kolakowski's definition, quote, positivism is a collection of prohibitions concerning human knowledge intended to confine the name of, quote, knowledge or, quote, science to those operations that are observable in the evolution of the modern sciences of nature, end quote. Leszek Kolakowski. See Kolakowski's book, The Alienation of Reason, A History of Positivist Thought. Not really seeing any descriptions of this book. It says, Amazon says, This succinct account of positivism from Hume to the Vienna Circle by contemporary Poland's most brilliant and provocative philosopher is a complete survey of, quote, positive philosophy, the term coined by Auguste Comte, which has persisted down to the present in the shorter form of, quote, positivism. Back to the text. Compare this with, quote, one of the tenets of positivism is methodological monism, or the idea of the unity of scientific method, ... A second tenet is the view that the exact natural sciences, in particular mathematical physics, set a methodological idea or standard which measures the degree of development and perfection of all other sciences, including the humanities, end quote. George Henrik von Wright, Explanations and Understanding, published in 1971. Explanations and Understanding by George Henrik von Wright is published with Cornell University Press. And there isn't a description here, but there's a little blurb from Philosophical Review that says, Explanation and Understanding, perhaps von Wright's best-known book, showed the influence of Wittgenstein, but marked a clean break with the positivism of his youth. He suggested that human action could not be explained causally by scientific or, quote, natural laws, but had to be understood, quote, intentionally. A concept connected with wants and beliefs developed in a social and cultural context. Actually, that quote is from the Daily Telegraph. This quote is from the Philosophical Review. This is a very good book packed with much original material. It also contains illuminating reinterpretations of some familiar theories and arguments. The range of topics treated includes causation, action, verification of gnomic statements, practical inference and its use in the explanation of action, and the structure of explanation in history. Back to the text. The definitions and discussions in also see the definitions and discussions in D.G. Charlton, Positivist Thought in France During the Second Empire, 1852 to 1870. And I'm not seeing any descriptions for this book. Okay. Sorry about that long detour through that footnote on positivism, but I think it would be helpful for us. End footnote. Each thinker has selected and prized only some features of the natural sciences: quantification, natural laws, objectivity, clarity, and so on. Comte is illustrative. Comte originally considered sociology a, quote, special kind of physics, end quote. By name and substance, Comte patterned social physics on the natural sciences. Comte retarded, quote, all phenomenon as subjected to invariable natural laws. Our business, ... is to pursue an accurate discovery of these laws with a view to reducing these laws to the smallest possible number, ... The best illustration of this is in the case of the doctrine of gravitation, end quote. Comte. Footnote. See Auguste Comte and Positivism, edited by Gertrude Lenzer. The description for Auguste Comte and Positivism, edited by Gertrude Lender, says, although Auguste Comte is conventionally acknowledged as one of the founders of sociology and is a key representative of positivism, few new editions of his writings have been published in the English language in this century. He has become virtually dissociated from the history of modern positivism and the most recent debates about it. Gertrude Lenzer maintains that the work of Comte is, for better or for worse, essential to an understanding of the modern period of positivism. This collection provides new access to the work of Comte and gives practitioners of various disciplines the possibility of reassessing concepts that were first introduced in Comte's writings. Today, much of the ordinary business of academic disciplines is conducted under the assumption that the realm of science is essentially separate from the realms of politics and science. A close reading of Comte will reveal how deeply such current ideas and theories were originally embedded in a particular context. One of his central methodological principles was that the theory of society had to be removed from the arena of political practice precisely in order to control that practice by means of these same sciences. It is in Comte's work that the reader will be able to observe how the forces of social and political reaction began to be powerfully organized to combat the critical forces in its own and later eras. Auguste Comte and positivism will be of importance to the work of philosophers, sociologists, political theorists, and historians. Back to the text. On Comte see Otwin Massing, Fortschritt und Gegenrevolution, die Gesellschaftslehre Comtes in ihrer sozialen Funktion. Published in Stuttgart in 1966. Yeah, can't look that up. And Oscar Necht, Structure Beziehungen zwischen den Gesellschaftslehren Comtes und Hegels, published in Frankfurt, 1964. See if there's a description for this book by Oscar Necht. Yeah, I'm not saying anything good. Okay. Back to the text and footnote. In one fashion or another, positivist quote science imitated and adopted the procedures of the natural sciences. It rang through, for example, the program of the Vienna Circle, the quote, scientific world conception, end quote. The program stated it was, quote, empiricist and positivist, end quote, and applied, quote, logical analysis, end quote. These features called forth others. A scientific world conception necessitated the, quote, search for a neutral system of formulae, for a symbolism freed from the slag of historical languages, ... Neatness and clarity are striven for, and dark distances and unfathomable depths rejected, end quote. Footnote. The Scientific Conception of the World, the Vienna Circle, by Otto Neurath, published in Empiricism and Sociology, published in English in 1973. The description of this book says, on the last day of his life, Otto Neurath had given help to a Chinese philosopher who was writing about Schlick. Only an hour before his death, he said to me, quote, nobody will do such a thing for me, end quote. My answer then was, quote, never mind, you have Bilston. Isn't that better, end quote? There were non-situations in new housing schemes, an exhibition in hopes for a fruitful relationship of longer duration. I did not dream at that time that I would one day work on a book like this. The The idea came from Horace M. Callan of the New School for Social Research, New York. Years later, to encourage me, he sent me his selection from William James's writings. Later, I met Robert S. Cohen. Carnap had sent him to me with the message, quote, "If you want to find out what my political views were in the 20s and 30s, read Otto Neurath's books and article of that time. His views were also mine," end quote. In this way, Robert Cohen became acquainted with Otto Neurath. Even more, he became interested when I asked him would he help me as an editor of an Otto Neurath volume. He agreed at once. In previous years, I had already asked a number of Otto Neurath's friends to write down for me what they especially remembered about him. I don't know, that was a shitty description. Anyway. It also looks like that book is available from the same place I'm getting this, Communist in Situ. End footnote. Quote, "The slag of historical languages," end quote, is the heap which separates the positivist science from the Hegelian, quote, Wissenschaft. For a Hegelian tradition, the slag of history is as valuable as the nuggets. History is not footnoted or dumped, but infuses the theory. Here, Hegelian and positivist science separate. The natural world and the natural world sciences know history only externally. It does not determine its structure or method. The difference between the study of the moon and the French Revolution is history. Human sciences inspired by the study of the moon or the atom suppress or belittle the historical dimension. History does not mean here a chronicle of events, but the story of humanity as actor and victim. As Hegel's greatest student wrote, quote, "Men make their own history," end quote, and added the crucial qualification, quote, "but they do not make it as they please," end quote. Marx, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. End footnote. Positive science tends to eliminate history as so much slag or intellectual baggage. To be sure, the natural world and the natural sciences are hardly impervious to history. The problems and approaches are themselves a product of history. But finally, the structure of the moon or the atom is not historical. Quote, "Human history," wrote Marx citing Vico, quote, "differs from natural history in that we have made the former and not the latter," end quote. Marx, Capital. The Hegelian, quote, Wissenschaft is not wider or larger than the positivist science. Rather, the Hegelian Wissenschaft is impregnated with history. The natural reality and natural sciences do not know the fundamental historical categories, consciousness and self-consciousness, subjectivity and objectivity, appearance and essence. In direct opposition to Neurath, wrote for the Vienna Circle, quote, "In science there are no, quote, depths. There is surface everywhere," end quote. Or, quote, "A scientific description can contain only the structure of objects, not their, quote, essence, ... Subjectively experienced qualities, redness, pleasure, are as such only experiences, not knowledge," end quote. Is that Otto Neurath? I don't know, footnote. It just says that, it says, the citation just says, "the scientific conception, the Vienna Circle." End footnote. Yet Hegelian thought must not be confused with mysticism or irrationality. It does not promote the cult of depths and essences. Positive and empirical sciences are not false, but limited. Quote, to such questions, sorry, there's a footnote. Footnote, the Hegel literature is out of hand. Some works I found helpful are Hans Radermacher, Hegel und der Positivismus, in Aktualität und Folgen der Philosophie Hegels, edited by Oscar Knecht. One second. Sorry. I'm not seeing anything for this. Theodor Litt, Hegel, published in 1958. It should be 1953. I'm not seeing anything for this. Back to the text. Jose M. Ripaldo, The Divided Nation, The Roots of a Bourgeois Thinker. By Jose Maria Ripaldo. Not seeing anything for this. Otto Pugler, Hegel's Idee einer Phänomenologie des Geistes, published in 1973. I'm not seeing anything for this book either. Andries Zarlemigen, Hegel's Dialectic. Okay. The description of this book says, this book was written in 1968 and defended as a doctoral dissertation before the Philosophical Faculty at the University of Freiburg, Switzerland, in 1969. It treats of the systematic views of Hegel, which led Hegel to give to the principle of non-contradiction, the principle of double negation, and the principle of excluded middle, meanings which are difficult to understand. The reader will look in vain for the philosophical position of the author. A few words about the intentions which motivated the author to study and clarify Hegel's thought are therefore not out of place. In the early 60s, when occupying myself with the history of Marxist philosophy, I discovered that the representatives of the logical positivist tradition were not alone in employing a principle of demarcation, that those of the dialectical Marxist tradition were also using such a principle, self-movement, as a foundation of a scientific philosophy and as a means to delimit unscientific ideas. I aimed at a clear conception of this principle in order to be able to judge whether, and to what extent, it accords with the foundations of the analytical method. In this endeavor, I encountered two problems. I guess this is just a copy and pasted from like the introduction. Back to the text, and finally, Wolfgang von Ziepen, Der Begriff der Negativität in dem jener Schriften Hegels. Not seeing anything for that either. Okay, so end footnote. Back to the text. Positive and empirical sciences are not false but limited. Quote, to such questions as when Caesar was born or how many feet there were in a stadium, etc., a neat answer should be given, just as it is surely true that the square of the hypotenuse equals the squares of the other two sides of a right-angled triangle. But the nature of such so-called truths is different from the nature of philosophical truths. End quote. Footnote, Hegel Text and Commentary, edited by Walter Kaufmann. The description for Hegel Text and Commentary by Walter Kaufmann, or edited by Walter Kaufmann, or translated, says, Herbert Marcuse called the preface to Hegel's Phenomenology, quote, one of the greatest philosophical undertakings of all times, end quote. This summary of Hegel's system of philosophy is now available in English translation with commentary on facing pages. While remaining faithful to the author's meaning, Walter Kaufmann has removed many encumbrances inherent in Hegel's style. Back to the text and footnote. The logic and approach of the empirical sciences and common sense is not so much true or untrue, but correct or incorrect. It does not attain truth. The judgment, quote, the rose is red, or, quote, is not red, can only be, quote, correct within the, quote, limited circle of perception, end quote. Footnote, Logic of Hegel, translated by W. Wallace in 1963. This is the first part of the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences in outline. End footnote. For Hegel, the ideal of the positive sciences, mathematics, is vulnerable to the same criticism. It is limited. As a single mode of cognition, mathematics is, quote, external and indifferent, end quote. Quote, our knowledge would be a very awkward predicament if such objects as freedom, law, morality, or even God himself, because they cannot be measured and calculated or expressed in a mathematical formula, were to be reckoned beyond the reach of exact knowledge, ... End quote. Hegel. As object and method, Hegel's, quote, Wissenschaft is saturated with history. This finally constitutes his protest against the positive and empirical sciences. They are historically blind and treat truth as formal and static. Quote, truth is not a minted coin which can be given and pocketed ready-made, end quote. Hegel, Text and Commentary. History is a means and ends. Quote, the harmoniousness of childhood is a gift from the hand of nature. The second harmony must spring from the labor and culture of the spirit, end quote. Hegel, Logic. From the historical process. Sorry, I read that weird. I'm going to read that sentence. The quote is from Hegel's Logic. Quote, the harmoniousness of childhood is a gift from the hand of nature. The second harmony must spring from the labor and culture of the spirit, end quote. From the historical process. These teachings of Hegel were neither well received nor preserved. The story of the impact of Hegelian thought takes volumes. It is germane here in regard to a single issue. The critique of positivist science, which does not collapse into irrationality or existentialism, is unthinkable without Hegelian thought. For this reason, the reception of Hegel by Marxists is fundamental. As the following chapter seeks to demonstrate, this conception preceded and defined the texture of the subsequent Marxism. In the major philosophical traditions, Hegel remains an outsider. For instance, Anglo-American courses in the history of philosophy typically end with Kant, and recommence in the 20th century with the troubling Hegel, as well as Marx, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, is regularly omitted or palmed off to the literature departments or to teachers not yet hired or about to be fired. Karl Popper's evaluation is not representative, at least suggests the deep and general mistrust. In The Open Society, a book Popper tells us grounded in a, quote, rational attitude, end quote, of, quote, openness of criticism, end quote. Popper credits the following judgment of Hegel as truthful and, quote, excellent. Quote, Hegel was a flat-headed, insipid, nauseating, illiterate charlatan who it says redhead. The pinnacle of audacity in scribbling together and dishing up the crassest mystifying nonsense. This nonsense has been noisily proclaimed as immortal wisdom by mercenary followers and readily accepted as such by all fools, end quote. Karl Popper, The Open Society and Its Enemies, Volume 2. The quotation is from Schopenhauer. And footnote, if Hegel fared better in the Marxist traditions, generally Hegel attracted little interest. Hegel was easily situated, interpreted, and forgotten with the aid of some phrases by Marx or especially some texts by Engels. Hegel was honored as the originator of idealistic dialectics, and with juggling these could be rendered materialistic and scientific. Ultimately, they were codified by Stalin into a set of laws. Footnote, Stalin, Dialectical and Historical Materialism, end footnote. Check out the book that I have on the channel by, why the hell can't I think of his name? Z.A. Jordan, about the history of so-called dialectical materialism. And footnote, what Lenin scribbled down during the enforced leisure of World War I, when Lenin began to study Hegel, remained a stray statement. Quote, it is impossible to understand Marx's Capital without understanding the whole of Hegel's logic. Consequently, no Marxists have understood Marx, end quote. Lenin, Conspectus of Hegel's book, The Science of Logic, in the Collected Works, Volume 38. Yet the role or lack of a role of Hegel should not be exaggerated, for the fate... I don't know, say this is... What the fuck does that say? It says F-A-T-I-E. The I looks like it has some kind of... I have no idea. I'm assuming it means fate. It's a type, and that's a typo. Yet the role or lack of a role of Hegel should not be exaggerated, for the some word of subsequent Marxism. Neither the presence or absence, accurate or inaccurate, interpretation of a single thinker can be held accountable for the vagaries of political and social movements. In this sense, the relation of Hegel to subsequent Marxism, or Darwin to social Darwinism, is not cause and effect. The founders succumbed to the imperatives of their followers. Yet that Hegel has been consistently misread and unread suggests something about the fabric of orthodox Marxism. Hegel proved a threat to the dominant idea of science. Consequently, orthodox Marxism has sought either to reduce Hegel to a positivist notion of science or purge Hegel from Marxism. This has remained a current project of orthodox Marxism. In recent years, Althusser assumed this task. Althusser is a short course on what is orthodox Marxism. Althusser's work has been marked by two closely related elements, a phobia of Hegel and a passion for science. Quote, "We have the right, and the duty, politically to use and defend, by fighting for the word, the philosophical category of, quote, science, to use and defend the word, quote, science, is a necessity in order to resist the bourgeois subjective idealists and petty bourgeois Marxists, end quote." Althusser, Essays in Self-Criticism. The main weapon of the petty bourgeois hordes is history, or historicism in Althusser's lexicon. History and historicism compromise the rigor of science. Marxism is no more historical than language. Quote, "which as Stalin showed, escaped bracket history," and bracket, end quote. Althusser. Footnote, see Marxism is not a historicism in Althusser and Balibar, reading Capital. And as I've said before, probably I'm reading this in chunks, so I'm not sure if I said it already, but that piece is in fact on this channel. Next to history, the main danger to science is Hegel. Althusser has met this danger through exorcism. Althusser has argued that the, quote, young Marx was never strictly speaking a Hegelian. Never strictly speaking a Hegelian, end quote. Except in 1844 when he broke with Hegel. Footnote, Louis Althusser, Introduction of For Marx. Althusser learned that this was not, strictly speaking, true, except in 1965 when he stated it. Later, Althusser discovered Hegel everywhere and recast his thesis so as to save it. Marx was engaged in a lifelong flight from Hegel, attaining safety only in death. With Althusser, anything short of rigor mortis lacks rigor. The living Marx was tainted with Hegel. Quote, "The famous preface of 1857 is still profoundly Hegelian evolutionist," end quote. Althusser. Preface to Capital in Lenin and Philosophy, end footnote. Althusser's it says Geiger counter picks up Hegelian rays. What the fuck is a Geiger? Is a Geiger counter something that I'm just too dumb to know, or is there some kind of typo here? Oh no, a Geiger counter is something that I didn't know. A Geiger counter, also known as a Geiger-Müller counter or GM counter, is an electronic instrument used for detecting and measuring ionizing radiation. A Geiger counter is widely used in applications such as radiation, dosimetry, radiological protection, experimental physics, and the nuclear industry. Quote, Geiger counter, end quote, is often used generically to refer to any form of decimeter, or radiation measuring device, but scientifically a Geiger counter is only one specific type of dosimeter. A Geiger counter detects ionizing radiation such as alpha particles, beta particles, and gamma rays using the ionizing effects produced in a Geiger-Müller tube, which gives its name to the instrument. In wide and prominent use as a handheld radiation survey instrument, the Geiger counter is perhaps one of the world's best-known radiation detection instruments. The original detection principle was realized in 1908 at the University of Manchester, but it was not until the development of the Geiger-Müller tube in 1928 that the Geiger counter could be produced as a practical instrument. Since then, it has been very popular due to its robust sensing element, and relatively low cost. However, there are limitations in measuring high radiation rates and the energy of incident radiation. The Geiger counter is one of the first examples of data sonification. Okay, so that's a Geiger counter. So look, if you knew that, and I congratulate you. I unfortunately did not. Althusser's Geiger counter picks up Hegelian rays even in capital. It is 1% Hegel. It's 1% Hegel is still unhealthy, as well as, quote, flagrant and extremely harmful, end quote. Althusser. Footnote, quote, a Hegelian evolutionist concept, disappears 99% in capital and completely in Marx's later texts, end quote. Althusser, end footnote. Only Marx's notes on Wagner, written the year of his death, are, quote, totally and definitely exempt from any trace of Hegelian influence, end quote. And the reason I'm repeating those words is because they were in italics. That generations of Marxists have been seduced by a popular idea of science cannot simply be traced to intellectual confusion. It is rooted, rather, in the ambivalent relationship of Marxism and bourgeois society. If Marx was capitalism's greatest critic, Marx was also bourgeois society's, or capitalism's, greatest admirer. Marx's own position can be presented theoretically with some precision, but more or less theoretically, it is presented individual Marxists of specific societies with endless difficulties. Capitalism was denounced for capitalism's exploitation, capitalism's brutality, pollution, hypocrisy, and the list goes on. Yet, capitalism was welcomed, even celebrated, insofar as capitalism represented a giant step out of a pre-bourgeois order. Socialism could only be established on the foundation and wealth that capitalism produced. Capitalism was not only indispensable, capitalism was desirable. The message for individual Marxists was more complex, especially those located in societies where the work of capitalism was uncompleted, and this included all Marxists, with the possible exception of the English. In all other societies, capitalism remained a progressive force, and the working class should abet capitalism until the material foundations for socialism had been created. The lesson was difficult and unpalatable. In January 1849, Marx advised the German Democrats and workers, quote, we are certainly the last people to desire the rule of the bourgeoisie, end quote. Yet, quote, it is better to suffer in modern bourgeois society, which by its industry creates the material conditions for the foundation of a new society that will liberate you all, than to revert to bygone form of society which, thrusts the entire nation back into medieval barbarism. One second, I'm going to copy that down. Footnote. Marx, Montesquieu, LV1 in Neue Rheinische Zeitung, January 21st, 1849, in Marx Engels Collected Works, Volume 8. This says it exactly, and perhaps too exactly, for this provoked responses from a, quote, ultra-left, impatient with its evolutionary logic. While these objections are generally ignored or slighted in the official histories, they touch a raw nerve of Marxism. Footnote: for a critique of Soviet accounts, see Boris Nikolaevsky, I don't know, Towards a History of the Communist League, 1847 to 1852. End footnote. In the aftermath of 1848, when these objections were raised, Marx advocated incremental social transformation. Protests emerged from various quarters and finally split the Communist League to which Marx and Engels belonged. Footnote: Marx's actions in politics in regard to the Cologne working class movement and the Communist League have been subject to much controversy. Part of the dispute concerns the authenticity of the deposition made by Peter Reuser, president of the Cologne Association of Workers. Peter Reuser reported, quote, both Marx and Reuser reported, quote, both Marx and Schaper want communism. This does not alter the fact that they are opponents or even enemies as soon as it comes to the methods. The supporters of Schaper and Willich want communism introduced at the present stage of development, if necessary by force of arms. To Marx, communism is possible only as a result of an advance in education and general development. In one of his letters he addressed to us, he distinguished the four phases through which it will be necessary to pass before it is achieved. End quote. Peter Reuser. Cited in B. Nikolaevsky and Otto Menschenhaufen, Karl Marx. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything, descriptions for that book. Continuing on in this footnote, the full text of Reuser and a further discussion can be found in Werner Blumenberg's article Zur Geschichte des Bundes der Kommunisten, die Aussagen des Peter Gerhard Reuser, an article published in 1964, and Fritz Bruegel Zur Geschichte des Kölner Arbeitervereins, published in Die Gesellschaft, 1930. That this was Marx's position, if not his words, is confirmed by the minutes of the meeting of the League in 1850. In an off-cited passage, Marx stated against Willich and Schaper, quote, while we say to the worker, you must pass through 15, 20, 50 years of civil war in order to change the relations, in order to make yourself capable of power, you say instead, we must immediately come to power or we can stay asleep, end quote. Marx. On Willich, see Lloyd D. Easton, Hegel's First American Followers. The full title of this book by Lloyd Easton is Hegel's First American Followers, the Ohio Hegelians, John B. Stallo, Peter Kaufman, Moncur Conway, and August Willich, with key writings. The notion that there was a definable, and this is the description, the notion that there was a definable group of intellectuals that should be called the, quote, Ohio Hegelians originated with this book. Lloyd Easton's Hegel's First American Followers, the Ohio Hegelians, published in 1966. Easton's extensive research and penetrating analysis of the lives of writings of John Stallo, who lived from 1823 to 1900, Peter Kaufman, who lived from 1800 to 1869, Moncure Conway, who lived from 1832 to 1907, and August Willich, who lived from 1810 to 1878, persuasively demonstrate that there was a group of intellectuals in Ohio during the mid to late 19th century that are worthy of the attention of historians and present-day philosophers. Even so, the Ohio Hegelians continue to be neglected because their writings are difficult to access. As with other American Hegelians, scholars know little about the complex philosophical details of the American reception of Hegel. End footnote. Back to text, end footnote. In the aftermath of 1848, when these objections were raised, Marx advocated incremental social transformation. Protests emerged from various quarters and finally split the communist movement, to which Marx and Engels belonged. Andreas Gottschalk asked Marx sarcastically, quote, "Why should we make a revolution? Why should we, men of the proletariat, spill our blood? Should we really escape the hell of the Middle Ages by precipitating ourselves into the purgatory of decrepit capitalist rule, ... Are you not serious about the liberation of the oppressed?" End quote. Andreas Gottschalk. Wikipedia says Andreas Gottschalk lived from 1815 to 1849. Andreas Gottschalk was a German physician. Andreas Gottschalk was a member of the Cologne Community Communist League. Andreas Gottschalk was an exponent of the, quote, left, sectarian tendencies of the German working class movement. Andreas Gottschalk founded and became president in April 1848 of the Cologne Workers' Association, which Andreas Gottschalk led until he was arrested in June of that year. Andreas Gottschalk was released from jail in December. After a short time abroad, he returned to Cologne, where he worked as a doctor for the poor until his death in the fall of 1849, having the previous year been, quote, cheered on by a crowd of 5,000, called for the establishment of a revolutionary committee, end quote, as part of the 1848 revolts. Andreas Gottschalk died after contracting cholera himself. Back to the text. Footnote. Cited in Hans Stein, Der Kölner Arbeiterverein, 1848-49, published in Cologne, 1921. On Andreas Gottschalk, see Ernst Jobel zur Geschichte des Kommunistenbundes in the Grünberg Archives. See David McClellan, Karl Marx, 1977. Edmund Zillberner, Moses Hess. Geschichte seines Lebens. Let's see if there's anything for this book. P.H. Noyes, Organization and Revolution, Working Class Associations in the German Revolution, 1848-49. there is actually a description of this book. It's published by, or republished, by Princeton University Press, and its full title is Organization, Revolution, Working Class Associations in the German Revolutions of 1848 to 1849 by P.H. Noyes. The description says, unlike previous histories which have generally described the uprisings of 1848 to 49 as revolutions of, quote, intellectuals, this shows that it was the economic distress of artisans and skilled craftsmen that caused them. Back to the text and footnote. The charge was not fair, yet it located a tension in Marxism which regularly degenerated into a simple affirmation. Where capitalism was uncompleted, Marxists were required to finish its work. The evil of retrograde social development was met by blessing capitalist development, which would finally issue into a new social order. The evolutionary logic was more than logic. This evolutionary logic was more than logic. It brought in its train attitudes and beliefs, which corroded the theoretical and psychological impulse to subvert capitalism. The evaluation of colonialism by Marx displayed these same features. Brutal robbery and exploitation marked colonialism. Yet insofar as the material foundations of capitalism were established, colonialism progressed willy-nilly towards socialism. This, in brief, constituted Marx's appraisal of the English colonization of India. Quote, the devastating effects of English industry, when contemplated with regard to India, are palpable and confounding, end quote. But England has a, quote, double mission, end quote, in India, destroying the old society, quote, and the laying of the material foundations of Western society in Asia, end quote. Quote, modern industry, will dissolve the hereditary division of labor upon which rest the Indian castes, whose decisive impediments to Indian progress and Indian power, end quote. Footnote. Marx, The Future Results of British Rule in India, featured in Karl Marx on Colonialism and Modernization, edited by Shlomo Avineri. Back to the text. From the Communist Manifesto to Capital, the same dialectical vision informed Marx's analysis of modern industry. Marx never doubted that the drive for profits constantly impelled the bourgeoisie to revolutionize the instruments of production. Quote, modern industry never views or treats the existing form of production process as the definitive form of the production process. Modern industry's technical basis is therefore revolutionary, whereas all earlier modes of production were essentially conservative, end quote. Yet the social relations in which the, quote, technical basis of production, end quote, was enmeshed constituted the devastating, quote, negative side, end quote. Marx, Capital. If the terms are clear enough, the substance is not. That it has taken countless scholars to determine exactly what Marx was saying only suggests the difficulty of Marxists faced with political options and choices. The history of Marxism is the history of the loss of the dialectical critique of bourgeois society. The irresistible temptation was to cast the dialectical movements of society into a one-way and upward path. Progress in capitalism was read as progress towards socialism. The text of Marx could always be interpreted in this light. Marxists were confident that their, quote, science was grounded in the actual movements of society. This distinguished Marxism from other and utopian socialism, which fled into the past or rural enclaves. For the Marxists, however, the critique of capitalism was corroded by the endorsement of capitalism's achievements. Every chapter in the history of Marxism has been rent by this dialectic. Every chapter in the history of Marxism has been rent by this dialectic, or inconsistency. The denunciation of capitalism vied with capitalism's affirmation. The beginnings of Russian Marxism conformed to this pattern, appealing to economic or cultural grounds. The populists argued that Russia would or should escape the disaster and evil of capitalism's development. The Marxists retorted that capitalism was and should develop in Russia. This laid the foundations for a proletariat and finally a socialist revolution. For these reasons, capitalism could be evaluated as progressive. Lenin's The Development of Capitalism in Russia, published in 1900, pursued this in detail. Inasmuch as the Russian Marxists strained to demonstrate the factual and positive impact of capitalism, the Russian Marxists were tempted to minimize capitalism's destructiveness. If, quote, more, capitalism was preferable to, quote, less, was the critique of capitalism itself vitiated? Lenin addressed directly this question, quote, recognition of the progressiveness of this role, bracket, of capitalism, end bracket, is quite compatible, with the full recognition of the negative and dark sides of capitalism, end quote. Lenin, The Development of Capitalism in Russia. Yet in practice, for many Russian Marxists, this recognition proved difficult to maintain. They extolled capitalism so enthusiastically they forgot about socialism or tired with it. They no longer grasped how or where socialism differed from capitalism. This set the stage for a return to religion. The, quote, legal Marxists were especially prey to this option. Serge Bulgakov exalted, as a Marxist, that, quote, every new factory, every new industrial enterprise carries us forward, end quote. And Serge Bulgakov ended as a priest decrying the, quote, mechanical necessity, end quote, of Marxism. Footnote. Bulgakov, as cited in Arthur P. Mendel, Dilemmas of Progress in Tsarist Russia, Legal Marxism and Legal Populism, published with Cambridge in 1961. Wikipedia says, Sergei Bulgakov lived from 1871 to 1944 and was a Russian Orthodox theologian, priest, philosopher, and economist. Orthodox writer and scholar David Bentley Hart had said that Bulgakov, quote, was the greatest systematic theologian of the 20th century. Father Sergei Bulgakov also served as a spiritual father and confessor to Mother Maria Skobtsova, who was canonized a saint by the Holy Synod of the Ecumenical Patriarchate on the 16th of January 2004. Sergei Bulgakov is best known for his teaching about Sophia, the wisdom of God, which received mixed reception. It was condemned by the Moscow Patriarchate in 1935, but without accusations of heresy. Back to the text. I'm going to actually look up this book that says Dilemmas of Progress in Tsarist Russia. Not seeing any description here. Back to the text and footnote. Struve, a legal Marxist, closed his major study with these words, quote, let us confess our cultural backwardness and let us learn from capitalism, end quote, and ended as a liberal. Footnote. Struve, as cited in Shmuel Galai, The Liberation Movement in Russia, 1900 to 1905, published in 1973. I don't think I'm seeing any description for this book. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything for this. There's no summary available for it, it says. See Richard Kindersley, The First Russian Revisionists, A Study of Legal Marxism in Russia. No description for this book. See Richard Pipes, Struve, Liberal on the Left, 1870 to 1905. Come on, piece of shit. The description for this book by Richard Pipes, Struve, Liberal on the Left, 1870 to 1905, says, more than anyone else in his time, Struve was the master of history, journalism, economics, international relations, and practical politics. A scholar and activist, he helped found the Marxist movement in Russia, initiated Marxist revisionism in Russia, and launched Lenin's career, and Struve was the theoretician and co-founder of the Constitutional Democratic Party. In writing about Struve, Richard Pipes turns biography into history. He lays bare the split soul of the Russian intellectuals, their irresponsibility, unwillingness to compromise, intolerance. Struve, the liberal turned conservative, preached to his countrymen physical and spiritual freedom based on law. He was a Westerner in his championing of social reform, legality, private property, and a vigorous state and foreign policy. This long and rich tradition of liberal conservatism is recounted against the background of a, quote, monstrous growth of political claims on the individual that cause intellectual and moral independence increasingly to be punished with ostracism, confinement, exile, and death, end quote. And if you don't know who Richard Pipes is, he's like one of the more well-known conservative historians of the Soviet Union and Russia, and was kind of dominant until like the revisionists, the historical revisionists in the 1960s, who kind of gave the Soviet Union a second look. See, back to the text, see Bastian Vilenga, Lenin's Weg zur Revolution, eine Konfrontation mit Sergei Bulgakov und Peter Struve im Interesse einer theologischen Besinnung. Not seeing anything for this book. See Solomon Schwartz's article, Populism in Early Russian Marxism on Ways of Economic Development of Russia, published in Continuity and Change in Russian and Soviet Thought, edited by E.G. Simmons. Doesn't look like there's any description of this book. And finally, Andrei Velitzky, The Controversy Over Capitalism, published in 1969. The book by Andrei Velitzky, The Controversy Over Capitalism, Studies in the Social Philosophy of the Russian Populace, is published with University of Notre Dame Press. And the description says, this book presents an analysis of classical Russian populism, shown as an ideological structure within which many positions were possible. Velitzky studies the confrontation of populism and Marxism, changing attitudes towards Marxism in the populist milieu, and the controversy between populists and Marxists over the future of Russia. The controversy over capitalism, available here in paper for the first time, reinterprets the ideology of Russian populism. Andrei Velitzky argues that populism is a reaction to the development of capitalism in Russia and a response to the capitalist economy and socialist ideologies of the West. Back to the text and footnote. Struve, as a legal Marxist, closed his major study with these words, quote, "Let us confess our cultural backwardness and let us learn from capitalism," end quote, and ended as a liberal. The same ambiguity corroded the Marxist opposition to colonialism. The Second International condemned colonialism as a violent appendage of capitalism. Yet to some Marxists, insofar as colonialism propelled the colonized along the path of industrialization, it served a necessary and positive function. As one exponent of a, quote, positive colonial policy put it, quote, "The primitive peoples will reach civilization only by bearing this cross, bracket, of capitalism, end bracket. It is therefore our duty not to hinder the development of capitalism, an indispensable chain in the history of humanity. We can even favor its appearance, ... end quote." This text is included in Marxism in Asia, edited by Helene Carrier de Encaus and S.R. Schramm. I'm not sure exactly what his first name is, but I think Schramm wrote a book on the thought of Mao Zedong and thought pretty favorably, positively. Stuart Schramm of Mao Zedong. Yeah. I'm at the footnote still. Si la Deuxième Internationale et l'Orient, edited by Georges Haupt and M. Veberiou, in Paris, 1967. For a summary of the debate on colonialism at Stuttgart, 1907, see Julius Braunthal, History of the International, Volume 1, 1864 to 1914. One second. I'm not seeing any descriptions for this book. Back to the text. For a good discussion of the issues, see Horace B. Davis, Nationalism and Socialism. Published in 1973. The description of nationalism and socialism, Marxist and labor theories of nationalism to 1917, was published by a monthly review press, and its description says, nationalism and socialism is a study in the history of Marxian ideas. It is also an attempt to show how the ideas are related to the society from which they sprang, and how the changes in social relations were reflected in the emergence of a whole new formulation of nationalist theory. Horace Davis brings together for the first time in English the contributions of many writers in the Marxist and labor camps, weird sentence, to the development of nationality theory down to 1917. The verbal battles between Bakunin and Engels, and between Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin, are shown to treat issues that mark the course of the entire 20th century. Back to the text. Horace B. Davis attacks Abraham Escher's Imperialists Within German Social Democracy prior to 1914, the article published in Journal of Central European Affairs. See also Max Fichter's article, Die Stellung der deutschen Sozialdemokratie zu den Fragen der Auswärtigen Politik, 1869 to 1914. End footnote. The evaluation of technology by Marxists succumbed to the same pressures. A dialectical critique was sloughed off. Marxists did not doubt that technology belonged to the greatest achievements of capitalism, distinguishing capitalism from all previous societies. The suffering of misfortune that technology yielded was due to the social context, not the apparatus itself. Such logic stuffed technology into familiar categories of means and ends. Technology was, as best and worst, a neutral endeavor. The evil resided only in the ends to which it was used. This approach infused orthodox Marxism, nor could it be accused of distorting Marx. Marx was always a sharp critic of utopian, feudal, and romantic socialism. Each was oblivious or antagonistic towards the technical advances of capitalist industrialization. Little seemed more certain than that Marxists accepted and even accelerated these advances. Nevertheless, a yawning gap between the general principles and particulars vitiated a critical appropriation of a technological world. Technology everywhere was welcomed as facilitating socialism, and for that reason was exempted from critical inspection. Marx can hardly be accused of blindness towards the destructiveness of the labor process. On occasion, however, Marx had suggested that the divisions of labor within the factory were, quote, planned and regulated, end quote, while those in the larger society were unregulated and anarchistic. Footnote, see Capital, pages 476 to 478. The notion was attractive and popular because it inferred that the factory and technology were the progressive elements of capitalism. Irrationality was confined to the marketplace and found its boundary at the factory gate. Furthermore, the notion accorded with common sense, which could confirm the confusion and lawlessness of the market, but was mute before the apparent rationality and efficiency of production itself. Yet such perspectives capitulated to the mystique of technology. It reduced revolution to sacking the bosses while protecting a sacrosanct, the technological basis. Footnote: recently attempts have been made to retrieve Marx's critique of technology and the division of labor. See Braverman, Labor and Monopoly Capital, published in 1974. The full description of this book says, for one, it's published by Monthly Review, and it says, the full description is Labor and Monopoly Capital, the Degradation of Work in the 20th Century. It says, this widely acclaimed work, first published in 1974, overturned the reigning ideologies of academic sociology and became the standard text for many basic areas of sociological inquiry, including the science of managerial control, the relationship of technological innovation to social class, and the eradication of skill from work under capitalism. A new foreword by John Bellamy Foster sets the work in historical and theoretical context. Also included are two rare articles by Braverman that add much to our understanding of the book. Quote, The Degradation of Work in the 20th Century, 1975, and, quote, Two Comments, 1976. Back to the text. See also my review, which elaborates some of the remarks in these pages. Let's see if there's any, the abstract, there's actually an abstract of this article by Harry Braverman. It says, Russell Jacoby's review of Harry Braverman says, quote, so the abstract says, one of the paradoxes of North American Marxism is that its generally impoverished history has yielded a body of literature, perhaps even a, quote, school, which is equal to any, and is read and studied throughout the world, the writings associated with Monthly Review. In part, this is no mystery. Paul Barron was European-born and educated, and the conduit for Paul Sweezy's Marxism was Schumpeter. In any case, Sweezy's The Theory of Capitalist Development, Braun's The Political Economy of Growth, and their Monopoly Capital, to name only the major works, have constituted a series of texts which have introduced a generation to a serious and non-dogmatic Marxism. Harry Braverman's Labor and Monopoly Capital is an able and articulate addition to this, quote, school. Back to the text. See also David F. Noble, America by Design, Science, Technology, and the Rise of Corporate Capitalism, published in 1977. The description of David F. Noble's America by Design, Science, Technology, and the Rise of Corporate Capitalism says, hailed a, quote, significant contribution, end quote, by the New York Times. David Noble's book, America by Design, describes the factors that have shaped the history of scientific technology in the United States. Since the beginning, technology and industry have been undeniably intertwined, and Noble demonstrates how corporate capitalism has not only become the driving force behind the development of technology in this country, but also how scientific research, particularly within universities, has been dominated by the corporations who fund it, who go so far as to influence the education of the engineers that will one day create the technology to be used for capitalist gain. Noble reveals that technology, often thought to be an independent science, has always been a means to an end for the men pulling the strings of corporate America, and it was these men that laid down the plans for the design, of the modern nation today. Back to the text, still reading the footnote. Herbert Marcuse has made a celebrated interpretation of technology as specific to capitalism. See William Leis's technological rationality, Marcuse and his critics in Leis's The Domination of Nature, published in 1972. The description for William Leis's book, The Domination of Nature, says, in Part 1, Leis traces the idea of the domination of nature from the Renaissance to the 19th century. Francis Bacon's seminal work provides the pivotal point for this discussion, and through an original interpretation of Bacon's thought, Leis shows how momentous ambiguities in the idea were incorporated into modern thought. By the beginning of the 20th century, the concept had become firmly identified with scientific and technological progress. This fact defines the tasks of Part 2. Using important contributions by European sociologists and philosophers, Leis critically analyzes the role of science and technology in the modern world. In the concluding chapters, he puts the idea of mastery over nature into historical perspective and explores a new approach based on the possibilities of the, quote, liberation of nature. Originally published in 1972, The Domination of Nature was part of the first wave of widespread interest in environmental issues. These issues have reemerged in many industrialized countries, reinforced by planetary dynamics such as threats of global warming or cooling and ozone depletion. In an extensive new preface, Leis explains why his study is as relevant as ever. Back to the text and footnote. Lenin's evaluation of technology, and Taylorism in particular, participated in this logic. The weakness of capitalist technology and Taylorism lay in its confinement to the factory. Quote, capital organizes and rationalizes labor within the factory, ... In social production as a whole, however, chaos continues to reign and grow, end quote. Lenin, The Taylor System, Man's Enslavement by the Machine, in Collected Works, Volume 20. Lenin recognized that the Taylor system, quote, like all capitalist progress, is a combination of refined brutality of bourgeois exploitation and a number of the greatest scientific achievements, end quote. The lesson was clear. Quote, the Soviet Republic must at all costs adopt all that is valuable in the achievements of science and technology in this field. The possibility of building socialism depends exactly upon our success in combining the Soviet power and the Soviet organization of administration with the up-to-date achievements of capitalism. We must organize in Russia the study and teaching of the Taylor system and systematically try the Taylor system out and adapt the Taylor system to our own ends, end quote. Lenin. The Immediate Tasks of the Soviet Government, in Selected Works 3 volumes, Volume 2. See Ulysses Santamaria and Elaine Manville, Lenin and the Problem of the Transition, published in Telos, 27th spring 1976. Let's see if there's an abstract for this piece. Hegel and the abstract for the piece says, Hegel noted the ruse of reason. Hegel followed its path in the unfolding of mind in the matrix of history. In turn, the Russian Revolution came to embody one of its most exemplary instances. The first people in the world to lead their own glorious revolution would, in the space of a few years, find themselves under the most despotic regime that history has known. Because of this reversal, it is necessary to find a reason for this tragic history, to fix its origins, to examine the reason for the ruse, and finally to display the contradictions. The contradiction. This contradiction already can be read in what Marx proclaims of socialism and in how Lenin replies to him. One second. I'm going to see if I can find this article. One second. I can't find it. Rainer Traub, Lenin and Taylor, published in Telos, 1978. I actually have that piece on this channel. F.J. Flaron and L.J. Flaron. Administrative Theory as Repressive Political Theory, The Communist Experience. Published in Telos 12, summer 1972. And the abstract for the article by Frederick J. Flaron and Lou Jean Flaron, titled Administration Theory as Repressive Political Theory, The Communist Experience, says, the central thesis to be argued in this paper is that administrative theory, as developed by Western social scientists, is inherently repressive, and that its utilization in communist states as a set of techniques for ordering human relationships has had a subversive effect on the communist goal of creating a more humanized society. We do not necessarily hold the view that in the absence of these particular techniques, communist states would be free from repression, but rather that these techniques themselves entail certain patterns of repression which are original to the societies in which those techniques were first developed and practiced. Back to the text. See also F.J. Flaron's edited volume Technology and Communist Culture, published in 1977. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything for that book. Back to the text and footnote. Stalin later defined Leninism as a combination of, quote, Russian revolutionary sweep with American efficiency, end quote. Stalin. Footnote. See Stalin's The Foundations of Leninism in The Essential Stalin, edited by B. Franklin, published in 1972. According to Robert Tucker, Bukharin originated this formulation. See Robert Tucker, Stalin is Revolutionary, 1879 to 1929. End footnote. The uncritical enthusiasm for technology was not grounded simply in the textual complexities of Marx, nor is the plan to adopt and accelerate capitalist industrialization based simply on a misreading of Marx. Such an argument ascribes to the text too much importance. Rather, the social economic imperatives of backwardness suppress the dialectical critique of technology. This resounds through Lenin. The work of capitalism was palpably incompleted, and if this was obvious to the Russians, Marxists in Italy, France, and Germany were no less convinced. Footnote: for the wider impact of Taylorism, see Charles S. Meyer's article Between Taylorism and Technology, European Ideologies and the Vision of Industrial Productivity, an article published in the Journal of Contemporary History, 5, 1970. I don't see any abstract for that. See also Paul Devenant, Scientific Management in Europe, published in 1927. This probably won't show anything either, but I have to look it up. Not finding it. Anyway, and back to the text and footnote. If today large regions within the industrial advanced countries are, quote, underdeveloped, evidently a century ago this was more striking. Of course, what constituted, quote, underdeveloped or, quote, overdeveloped is the essence of the matter. Footnote: some years ago, Andre Gunther Frank sparked a debate re-examining the terms and realities of development and underdevelopment. See especially The Development of Underdevelopment and Sociology of Development in Gunther Frank's Latin America, Underdevelopment or Revolution. Later contributions included Emanuel Wallerstein's edited volume World Inequality, published in Montreal, and Arguri Emanuel, Unequal Exchange, and Samir Amin, Accumulation on a World Scale. And the description for Gunther Frank's Latin America, Underdevelopment or Revolution says, in his second book, Andre Gunther Frank expands on the theme presented in his influential study, Capitalism and Underdevelopment in Latin America, is the colonial structure of world capitalism in Gunther Frank's view, which produced and maintains the underdevelopment characteristic of Latin America and the rest of the Third World. The colonial structure penetrates everywhere in Latin America, forming and transforming all its features in obedience with its own imperatives, and thereby imposing upon the region those characteristic features of poverty and backwardness, which are not primarily the remnants of an ancient, quote, feudal past, but the direct products of capitalism. This development of underdevelopment will persist, therefore, until the people of Latin America free themselves from world capitalism by means of revolution. The Cuban Revolution is thus viewed as the first effort in a continent-wide revolutionary process directed against both imperialism and the national bourgeoisie. The thesis, which in the author's first book was spelled out for Chile and Brazil, is here extended to Latin America as a whole. A number of essays are devoted to examining the North American emperor's ideological clothes and exposing the scientific nakedness behind the sham theories. Further essays are devoted to some of the economic aspects and political manifestations of imperialism. And a final group of essays brings the discussion onto the domestic scene in Latin America, where debate over strategy and perspectives raged among revolutionaries. Since much of this debate related to differing conceptions of the structure of society in Latin America, the author's investigations had a direct bearing on the various lines of revolutionary policy proposed. The immediate tactical enemy of the revolutionaries, the author argued, is their own bourgeoisie, notwithstanding that their principal strategic enemy remains imperialism. Okay, so that's Gunther Frank's Latin America Underdevelopment or Revolution. Wallerstein Inequality. And this was actually released by Black Rose Books. And the description says, experts from various fields in many countries offer views through this selection of articles constituting an international debate on inequality and development. Origi Emmanuel, Unequal Exchange. The description for this book says, monograph on the economic theory of the role of developed countries in practicing disadvantageous terms of trade towards developing countries. The role of developed countries in practicing disadvantageous terms of trade toward developing countries examines internal and external prices, unequal exchange rates, an international division of labor, growing gaps in wage rates, etc., and contains a discussion between the author and Charles Bettelheim on his theory and the political aspects thereof. And the description of Samir Amin's accumulation on a world scale, a critique of the theory of underdevelopment, says, Samir Amin has undertaken an ambitious task, nothing less than an analysis of the process of capital accumulation on a global level. Drawing on a wide range of empirical material from Africa and the Middle East, Amin attempts to demonstrate through a critique of writings on, quote, underdevelopment, how accumulation in advanced capitalist countries prevents development, however that may be defined, within the peripheral social formations, usually referred to as, quote, underdeveloped countries. Samir Amin ranks among those who realize the necessity not merely to comprehend the growing crisis of world capitalism as it manifests within individual nation states, but also at the world level. Back to the text and footnote. The uncritical enthusiasm for technology was not grounded simply in the textual complexities of Marx. Wrong starting point. If today large regions within the industrial advanced countries are, quote, underdeveloped, evidently a century ago this was more striking. Of course, what constituted, quote, underdeveloped or, quote, overdeveloped is the essence of the matter. Marx studied England because Marx was convinced other West European countries would replicate England's history. Quote, the country that is more developed industrially only shows to the less developed the image of its future, end quote. Germany, in comparison, suffered, quote, not only from the development of capitalist production, but also from the incompleteness of that development, end quote. Marx, Capital. Page 91. The, quote, incompleteness of economic development as factor conviction encouraged the acceptance of evolutionary theories. For the first generation of Marxists after Marx, capitalism proved its inability not only to limp along. For the first generation of Marxists after Marx, capitalism proved capitalism's ability not only to limp along, but develop and expand. The last part of the century witnessed not only the perfecting of new industrial technology, cheap steel, electric power, but a transformation of the character of consumption, sewing machines, cheap clocks, bicycles, electric lighting. Footnote. For a survey, see David S. Landis's book, The Unbound Prometheus, Technological Change and Industrial Development in Western Europe. From 1750 to the present. According to Wikipedia, The Unbound Prometheus, Technological Change and Industrial Development in Western Europe from 1750 to the present, is an economic history by David S. Landis. Its focus is on the Industrial Revolution in England, and its spread to the rest of Western Europe. Its principal contribution is the argument in favor of the Second Industrial Revolution. The book was first published in 1969 by Cambridge University Press. The Unbound Prometheus first appeared in the Cambridge Economic History of Europe, Volume 6, in 1965, but it was expanded for the 1969 edition. The Unbound Prometheus deals with innovations and inventions that brought about modernization and technological developments in Western Europe beginning in the 18th century. The Unbound Prometheus explores why Europe was the first to industrialize and argues that industrialization is just one part of a larger process of modernization, during which a culture significantly changes that culture's social order, institutional order, attitudes, values, and government in order to promote and accommodate further change. Bracket citation needed. In addition, The Unbound Prometheus also discusses the economic boom that has occurred since the Industrial Revolution began and argues that only through continued industrialization can the world sustain itself economically in the coming years. The book is considered by many, bracket citation needed, end bracket, to be one of the most significant books on the economic history of industrialization in Western Europe, bracket, by whom, question mark, end bracket. It is considered, bracket, by whom, question mark, end bracket, to be one of the preeminent works on the economic history of industrialization in Western Europe. It has been reprinted numerous times and was published in a second edition with new commentary by Landis in 2003. Back to the text. End footnote. That these were not equally distributed is not to the point. They never were in the past. They suggested, however, that capitalism had hardly ceased to progress. The evolutionary progress of capitalism called forth and ratified the evolutionary and scientific doctrines of Marxists. The critique of bourgeois society, Marxism, progressively lost its bite. The distance between Marxism and bourgeois society narrowed. Marxists and their opponents shared the belief in science, progress, and success. Revolution was not simply adjourned. Rather, the Marxists embraced the scientific and industrial rationality as his own. The Marxists saw themselves as perfecting and accelerating the advances of capitalism. The phenomenon of Marxist extolling and finally succumbing to capitalism did not go completely unnoticed. If the participants were blind, those on the outside or margins of Marxism were not. It is hardly fortuitous that the historian and sociologist of capitalist rationality, Max Weber, recognized the spirit of capitalism in the lair of the Marxists. Weber visited a party congress of the German Social Democrats in 1906 and concluded, quote, "These gentlemen no longer frighten anyone," end quote. Max Weber. Footnote. See Wolfgang Mommsen, Max Weber und die deutsche Politik, 1890 to 1920. Christ on the cross.
It's good to get the warning
Not seeing anything for that book. See also Mommsen, Max Weber, Gesellschaft, Politik und Geschichte. So that would be Max Weber, Society, Politics, and History. There's a description for this book. It's published by Surkamp Verlag. I'm going to try to translate this piece of shit into English. And here we go. Wolfgang Mommsen's Max Weber, Society, Politics, and History, published with Surkamp, says, the present essays attempt to clarify central problems of Max Weber's political thought, and particularly the role of political leadership in a bureaucratic society, but also to illuminate the universal historical context from which these gain their real significance. In doing so, Weber's liberal worldview, based on aristocratic individualism, is worked out, and the alternative to his position to that of Karl Marx is systematically presented. In addition, Weber's historiographical work and Weber's contribution to the methodology of a historical social science are discussed. Back to the text and footnote. Weber visited a party congress of the German Social Democrats in 1906 and concluded, quote, "These gentlemen no longer frighten anyone," end quote. The following year, he debated conservative sociologists on the threat of a social democratic electoral victory in several German cities. Quote, "I see no danger for bourgeois society in surrendering our cities to to the SPD," end quote, Weber stated. Weber noted that, quote, "no revolutionary enthusiasm was expressed at the recent SPD Congress," end quote, and Weber anticipated that a victorious SPD would follow a, quote, "mercantile policy," end quote, encouraging the growth of capital. Footnote: Schriften des Vereins für Sozialpolitik. What's that? I have no idea what that means. Writings on something for social politics. Verhandlungen der Generalversammlung in Magdeburg, 1907. Published in 1908. See Dieger Lindenbaum, Richtungskampfe im Verein für Sozialpolitik, Part 2. End footnote. The profound complexity of orthodox Marxism and bourgeois industrialization is exposed by an absence. In the Marxist tradition, a searching critique of the, quote, secondary characteristics of capitalism is lacking. Secondary refers to those features that stand once removed from the primary economic organization of wages, working conditions, imperialism, and the like. It refers to a series of relations, such as urbanism, mass media, psychological life, leisure, and so on. These are not necessarily second in importance, but second insofar as they cannot exist apart from the basic political-economic organization of society. In recent decades, these areas increasingly drew the attention of Marxists, but in the past, Marxists ignored them. The few analyses offered have been pedestrian and predictable. The secondary features have been disposed of by concepts taken from the basic dictionary of Marxism, superstructure, relations of production, accumulation, and so on. If none of these concepts has been wrong, none has grasped the specificity of the phenomenon. The usual explanation for the banality of Marxism here refers to the ills of, quote, vulgar Marxism. Vulgar Marxism is vulgar in its economic reductionism. Beyond an economic base, everything lacks substance and reality. As an explanation for the lameness of Marxism, this does not suffice. Not only vulgar Marxism, but Marxism's vulgar critique needs to be surmounted. The vulgar critique of vulgar Marxism glosses over the complicity between the Marxists and the secondary features of capitalism. This is the reason for blindness. They did not perceive these features as fundamentally changing, hence there was no reason for scrutiny. The Marxists would inherit the cities and the mass newspapers, only the signs and headlines would be changed. Rockefeller Plaza would become Leninplatz. The basic rapport with industrial life paralyzed the critique. This can be stated in the obverse more emphatically. The most compelling and illuminating analyses of the secondary processes derive from a conservative, sometimes reactionary tradition. This runs from Nietzsche and Spengler to contemporary and surely lesser critics such as Jacques Ellul and Ivan Illich. I believe it says Ellul and Illich, but I think it's Jacques Ellul and Ivan Illich. This is hardly a coherent tradition, and it is radically flawed in more than one respect, yet the analyses that are proffered are unmatched and unassimilated by Marxists. To cite a single example, Oswald Spengler's analysis of the daily press from 1919 found no counterpart in the Marxists. Quote, English-American politics have created through the press, a force field of worldwide intellectual and financial tensions in which every individual unconsciously takes up the place allotted to him, so that he must think, will, and act as a ruling personality, somewhere or other in the distance he thinks fit. Man does not speak to man. The press and the press's associate, the electrical news service, keeps the waking consciousness of whole peoples and continents under a deafening drumfire of these catchwords, standpoints, scenes, feelings, day by day and year by year, The scattered sheets of the Age of Enlightenment transform themselves into the press, a term of most significant anonymity, Today we live so cowed under the bombardment of this intellectual artillery that hardly anyone can attain to the inward detachment that is required for a clear view of the monstrous drama, The liberal bourgeois mind is proud of the abolition of censorship, the last restraint, while the dictator of the press, Northcliffe, keeps the slave gang of his readers under the whip of his leading articles, telegrams, and pictures. Northcliffe was a newspaper and publishing magnate, owner of the Daily Mail and Daily Mirror. Democracy has, by its newspapers, completely expelled the book from the mental life of the people. Democracy has, by its newspapers, completely expelled the book from the mental life of the people. Again, this is still a quote from Spengler. The people read the one paper, its paper, which forces itself through the front doors by millions daily, spellbinds the intellect from morning to night, drives the book into oblivion by its more engaging layout. And if one or another specimen of a book does emerge into visibility, forestalls and eliminates its possible effects by, quote, reviewing it. What the press wills is true. The press's commanders evoke, transform, interchange truths. 3 weeks of press work, and the truth is acknowledged by everybody, The reader neither knows nor is allowed to know the purpose for which he is used, ... A more appalling caricature of freedom of thought cannot be imagined. Formerly a man did not dare to think freely. Now he dares but cannot. End quote. Oswald Spengler, The Decline of the West, 1-volume edition. Published 1959. Wikipedia says, The Decline of the West, more literally The Downfall of the Occident, is a 2-volume work by Oswald Spengler. The first volume, subtitled Form and Actuality, was published in the summer of 1918. The second volume, subtitled Perspectives of World History, was published in 1922. The definitive edition of both volumes was published in 1923. Spengler introduced his book as a, quote, Copernican overturning, end quote, a specific metaphor of societal collapse, involving the rejection of the Eurocentric view of history, especially the division of history into the linear, quote, ancient, medieval, modern, end quote, rubric. According to Oswald Spengler, the meaningful units of history are not epochs but whole cultures which evolve as organisms. In Spengler's framework, the terms, quote, culture and, quote, civilization were given non-standard definitions, and cultures are described as having lifespans of about 1,000 years of flourishing and 1,000 years of decline. To Oswald Spengler, the natural lifespan of these groups was to start as a, quote, race, become a, quote, culture, as it flourished and produced new insights, and then became a, quote, civilization. Spengler differs from others in seeing the final civilization stage as necessarily, quote, better than the early stages. Spengler differed from others in not seeing the final civilization stage as necessarily, quote, better than the earlier stages. Rather, the military expansion and self-assured confidence that accompanied the beginning of such a phase was a sign that the civilization had arrogantly decided it had already understood the world and would stop creating bold new ideas, which would eventually lead to a decline. For example, to Spengler, the classical world's culture stage was in Greek and early Roman thought. The expansion of the Roman Empire was its civilization process, and the collapse of the Roman and Byzantine empires their decline. Spengler believed that the West was in its, quote, evening, similar to the late Roman Empire, and approaching its eventual decline despite its seeming power. Spengler recognized at least 8 high cultures: Babylonian, Egyptian, Chinese, Indian, Mesoamerican, Mayan/Aztec, Classical, Greek/Roman, Apollonian, the non-Babylonian Middle East, Magian, and Western or European, Faustian. Spengler combined a number of groups under the, quote, Magian label: Semitic, Arabian, Persian, Arabian, it says Arabian, Arabian, Persian, and the Abrahamic religions in general as originating from them: Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Similarly, he contributed various Mediterranean cultures. He combined various Mediterranean cultures of antiquity, including both ancient Greece and ancient Rome, as, quote, Apollonian, and modern Westerners as, quote, Faustian. According to Spengler, the Western world was ending, and the final season, the, quote, winter, of Faustian civilization was being witnessed. In Spengler's depiction, Western man was a proud but tragic figure because while he strives and creates, he secretly knows the actual goal will never be reached. Back to the text and footnote. This assault on capitalism can be found in Nietzsche's analysis of morality and bad conscience, or more recently, Illich's discussion of the medicalization of society. Footnote: see Ivan Illich's Medical Nemesis, The Expropriation of Health. The description for Medical Nemesis, The Expropriation of Health, published by Ivan Illich with Pantheon Books in 1976, says, "The medical establishment has become a major threat to health. The disabling impact of professional control over medicine has reached the proportions of an epidemic. Latrogenesis, the name for this new epidemic, comes from iathros, the Greek word for physician, and genesis, meaning origin. Discussion of the disease of medical progress has moved up on the agendas of medical conferences. Researchers concentrate on the sick-making powers of diagnosis and therapy, and reports on paradoxical damage caused by cures for sickness take up increasing space in medical dope sheets, ... The public has been alerted to the perplexity and uncertainty of the best among its hygienic caretakers, ... This book argues that panic is out of place. Thoughtful public discussion of the iatrogenic pandemic, beginning with an insistence upon demystification of all medical matters, will not be dangerous to the common weal," end quote. That's from the introduction to the book. Back to the text and footnote. These conservative critics penetrate and grasp phenomena that the Marxists revere and pass over. The sources of their insights are at hand, unlike the Marxists. They find capitalist rationality and progress grating. This allows and encourages insights barred to the Marxists, less hostile to the beat of capitalism. The Marxists bear the squeaks and groans. The Marxists hear the squeaks and groans, where the mechanisms needs oil and new bearings. To these critics, the hum itself is offensive. To many of the conservatives, Marxism itself appeared as simply another industrialization scheme. Conventional liberalism and the wisdom feared Marxism as a threat to capitalist industrialization. These critics feared the opposite. Marxism accelerated industrialization. Spengler considered Marxism a version of the English Industrial Revolution. It concentrated on business, profits, and classes. Marx was a, quote, exclusively English thinker, end quote, adopting the terms, ethics, and categories of the Industrial Revolution. Quote, Marx took his principles from the very thing he was fighting, end quote. Marx intended to extend capitalism to the working class, turning each worker into a merchant who sells his labor at the highest price. In the light of the history of Marxism and trade unions, Spengler's judgment cannot be rejected as simply perverse. Quote, Marxism is the capitalism of the working class, end quote. Spengler, in the article Prussianism and Socialism in Selected Essays. This position contrasting Prussian to English socialism was not unique to Spengler. It reached back to Fichte and forward to Zombart. See Zombart's Deutscher Sozialismus, published in 1934. Not seeing any description for that book. Which juxtaposes German to proletarian socialism. The latter is the theory of Marx and industrialization. See Stutz, Oswald Spengler as politischer Denker. Now I'm not seeing any descriptions for this book. See Ernst Stutz, Oswald Spengler as politischer Denker. That's Oswald Spengler's political thinker. Published in 1958, which locates Spengler within 20th century, quote, within a 20th century, quote, conservative revolution. For predecessors, see Hans J. Schupps, Vorläufer Spengler, 1955, and Anton M. Kotenek, Oswald Spengler in seiner Zeit. Not seeing anything for that either. End footnote. It is not coincidental that the few Marxists who swam against the tide of capitalist rationality did not sever all links to conservatism, romanticism, or utopianism. They remained attached to a non-capitalist logic. This includes William Morris in the 19th century, Ernst Bloch, André Breton, and the Frankfurt School of the 20th century. Their intellectual sources enabled them to see through the mirror of the economy. They were alerted not simply to the falling rate of profit, but the falling rate of intelligence and beauty. The resistance to socialism as a souped-up version of capitalism draws these figures together. One second. Shit. I gotta copy this down. The Orthodox, footnote. See My Falling Rate of Intelligence, Telos, 1976. The reason I'm actually kind of turned on to Russell Jacoby, I've known of his existence for a long time. In fact, I think I've listened to some of his talks at some point. But Ka Era Verlag is publishing a compendium of his in German, and I was looking at the essays, and anyway, the compendium's called A Falling Rate of Intelligence. End footnote. The unorthodox Marxist retrieved the substance of Marx. Socialism promised more than a rise in wages or an expansion of cities. A rise in wages, Marx wrote in Capital, quote, only means in fact that the length and weight of the golden chain the laborer has already forged for himself allows it to be loosened somewhat, end quote. Marx, Capital. Neither the elevation nor the equalization of wages was the goal of Marx's socialism. Marx, early and late, denounced, quote, barracks communism, end quote, or Kasernenkommunismus. Footnote, quote, we have tried on the one hand to refrain from all system-making and all barrack room communism, end quote. Published in Circular of the First Congress of the Communist League to League members, June 1847, in Marx Engels' Collected Works, Volume 6. While this was not authored by Marx or Engels, it is probably written under Engels' supervision and referred to his, quote, draft of a Communist Confession of Faith, end quote, available in Collected Works, Volume 6. See also Marx's denunciation of barracks communism in Ein Komplott gegen die IAA. IAA, I guess which might be IWA, International Working Men's Association in German. Because worker is Arbeit. So it might be Arbeiter Association, International Arbeiter Association, or something, some pronunciation of that. End footnote. Liberation is more than electing the bosses, trading subjugation for self-subjugation. Quote, criticism has plucked the imaginary flowers on the chain, not in order that man shall continue to bear that chain without fantasy or consolation, but so that he shall throw off the chain and pluck the living flower. End quote. Marx, Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, Introduction. The idioms diverge, but not the basic thinking of the unorthodox Marxists. Morris cautioned again and again not to confuse, quote, the machinery of socialism, end quote, with socialism, to substitute, quote, a business-like administration in the interests of the public, end quote, for a laissez-faire and coercive regime would be a great gain, but not the goal. Socialism is not utilitarianism, it is leisure. Quote, the leisure which socialism above all things aims at obtaining for the worker is also the very thing that breeds desire for beauty, for knowledge, for more abundant life, in short. Footnote. William Morris, Communism, in Morris Prose Verse Lectures and Essays, edited by G.D.H. Cole. Not seeing any description of that collection. End footnote. Footnote. The worker's share of art in Morris' Selected Writings and Designs, edited by A. Briggs. I'm not seeing any description. Oh, no. Yeah, not seeing actually any good descriptions of this book. No. Thompson, in his 1970, back to the text, Thompson, in his 1976 postscript to William Morris, published in 1977, puts the issue well, quote, the Romantic tradition is not to be defined only in terms of its traditional, conservative, quote, regressive, quote, escapist, and, quote, utopian characteristics, and hence to be seen as a continual undertow threatening to draw Morris back to, quote, subjectivism and, quote, idealism, end quote. E.P. Thompson. End footnote. Bloch salvaged the utopian and romantic note in Marxism. Footnote. Cited in David Gross, Marxism and Utopia, Ernst Bloch in Towards a New Marxism, edited by Grohl and Picone. Picone was one of the leading people in telos. An introduction and 10 major studies of a, quote, new Marxism. Paul Picone, Paul Brains, Georg Lukács, and the Old and New Culture. David Gross on Ernst Bloch, Dick Howard on Existentialism, Raya Dunayevskaya, Paul Bula, Lucio Coletti, Howard Parsons, Proceedings of the International Telos Conference, Ontario. Back to the text. See also Maynard Solom's Marx and Bloch, published in Maynard Solomon, Marx and Bloch. Published in Telos 13, fall 1972. The description of this article says, Lenin described the three sources and chief component parts of Marxism as German idealist philosophy, British political economy, and French utopian socialist thought. In this, he was only reiterating and systematizing the many acknowledgments by Marx, and especially Engels, of their debts to their predecessors. Curiously, and no doubt inevitable, however, this piety took the form of negation, and not in the Hegelian sense, of cancellation, transcendence, preservation. During the Kautskyist and Stalinist periods, the component study of Marxism, and the representatives and symbols of those sources, including utopianism, were anathematized. Marxism was said to have progressed from utopia to science, to have rationalized the irrational elements in all prior systems. That's the end of the abstract to Marx and Bloch, Reflection on Utopian Art by Maynard Solomon. Back to the text. See also Oscar Necht, the German philosopher of the October Revolution. I don't think I'm seeing any description of this article by Oscar Necht. See also Jürgen Habermas, Ernst Bloch, A Marxist Romantic, published in Salmagundi, 10th to 11th, 1969 to 1970. Douglas Kellner and Harry O'Hara's article, Utopia and Marxism, in Ernst Bloch. And Helmut Reinecke, Material und Revolution, eine materialistische erkenntnistheoretische Untersuchung zur Philosophie Ernst Bloch. Not seeing anything for that. Yeah, I'm not seeing it. I'm not seeing anything for that piece, that book. I've seen Helmut Reinecke's name before. End footnote. Bloch salvaged the utopian and romantic note in Marxism. The, quote, naked economic orientation, end quote, parallelized orthodox Marxism. Footnote. See Bloch durch die Wüste. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything for that book. And footnote. Bloch, Geist der Utopie. And that's actually the Spirit of Utopia by Ernst Bloch. And the description says, I am, we are, that is enough, now we have to start. These are the opening words of Ernst Bloch's first major work, The Spirit of Utopia, written mostly in 1915-16, published in its first version just after the First World War, republished 5 years later in 1923, in the version here presented for the first time in English translation. The Spirit of Utopia is one of the great historic books from the beginning of the century, but it is not an obsolete one. In its style of thinking, a peculiar amalgam of biblical, Marxist, and expressionist turns, in its analytical skills, deeply informed by Zimmel, taking its information from both Hegel and Schopenhauer for the groundwork of its metaphysics of music, but consistently interpreting the cultural legacy in the light of a certain Marxism. Bloch's Spirit of Utopia is a unique attempt to rethink the history of Western civilizations as a process of revolutionary disruptions, and to reread the artworks, religions, philosophies of this tradition as incentives to continue disrupting. The alliance between Messianism, which was proclaimed in this book for the first time with epic breadth, has met with more critique than acclaim. The expressive and baroque diction of the book was considered as offensive as its stubborn disregard for the limits of, quote, disciplines. Yet there is hardly a, quote, discipline that didn't adopt, however unknowingly, some of Bloch's insights, and his provocative associations often proved more productive than the statistical account of social shifts. The first part of this philosophical meditation, which is also a narrative and analysis, a rhapsody, and a manifesto, concerns a mode of, quote, self-encounter that presents itself in the history of music, from Mozart through Mahler, as an encounter with the problem of a community to come. This, quote, we problem is worked out by Bloch in terms of a philosophy of the history of music. The, quote, self-encounter, however, has to be conceived as, quote, self-invention, as the active affirming fight for freedom and social justice under the sign of Marx. The second part of the book is entitled Karl Marx, Death and the Apocalypse. I am, we are, that's hardly anything, but enough to start. So, back to the text and footnote. If the quote, naked economic orientation and, quote, paralyzed orthodox Marxism, if the economy had been analytically subverted by the Marxists, lacking was the, quote, soul and the, quote, belief to replace it. For Bloch, the path from utopia to science, the title of the popular Engels pamphlet, skipped too much. It eliminated not simply the utopian vision, but the utopian vision's driving force. What Bloch called the, quote, warm current, end quote, of Marxism must be retrieved, lest it be suffocated by the, quote, old current, the cold current, end quote, of technocratic Marxism. Breton, like Bloch, refused to sever links to supra-economic logic and terrains. Breton refused the either-or of orthodoxy, either electrification or imagination. Quote, in the realm of facts as we see it, no ambiguity is possible. All of us seek to shift power from the hands of the bourgeoisie to those of the proletariat. Meanwhile, it is nonetheless necessary that the experiments of inner life continue. End quote. André Breton. Legitimate Defense, published in 1926, and Breton, What is Surrealism? What is Surrealism? Selected writings by André Breton, who lived from 1896 to 1966. André Breton was the founder and major theorist of the Surrealist movement, one of the most vital currents of modern poetry and revolutionary thought. This compilation of Breton's writings gives a compact survey of his views and the perspectives of international surrealism as they have developed through more than half a century, and as they serve to guide the groups and individuals who, in dozens of countries, have taken up the surrealist cause. About half of the selections are published here in English for the first time. Others are reprinted from scarce out-of-print periodicals. The editor, Franklin Rosemont, I think is like a American surrealist who also works with like the IWW, met Breton in 1966, and later that year organized the first indigenous U.S. surrealist group. Franklin Rosemont is the author of 2 books of poems and the Manifesto and the Position and Direction of the Surrealist Movement in the United States, published in 1970. Franklin Rosemont played a major role in organizing the 1976 World Surrealist Exhibition in Chicago, by far the largest exhibition ever prepared by the Surrealists. Franklin Rosemont lives in Chicago, where he edits Arsenal/Surrealist Subversion, English language journal of the International Surrealist Movement. Back to the text. This is still the footnote. Quote, I really fail to see, some narrow-minded revolutionaries notwithstanding, why we should refrain from supporting the revolution, provided we view the problems of love, dreams, madness, art, and religion from the same angles as they do. End quote. Breton, Second Manifesto Surreal. All right, I'll see you. That's from Breton, Second Manifesto Surrealism. See generally Maurice Nadeau, The History of Surrealism, published in 1965. See Herbert Gershman, The Surrealist Revolution in France. And Matthews, Towards the Poetics of Surrealism, 1976. The conventional interpretation of the contradictions between surrealism and Marxism can be found in Robert S. Short's article, The Politics of Surrealism, 1920 to 1936. In Left-Wing Intellectuals Between the Wars, edited by W. LeCoeur and G.L. Mose. I'm going to see if any of these books have descriptions. The History of Surrealism by Maurice Nadeau says, the description says, quote, I believe, Andre Breton said, quote, in the future resolution of the states of dreams and reality, in appearance so contradictory, in a sort of absolute reality, or surrealite. The surrealist movement, born in the 1920s out of the ferment of Dada, committed to revolution against bourgeois rationalism, and inspired by Freudian exploration of the unconscious, has reverberated more widely and deeply than perhaps any other art movement in our century. Its automatism, biomorphic shapes, visionary mode, and manipulation of found objects mark the work of artists as different as Ernst Miro, Margit, and Dali. Maurice Nadeau's History of Surrealism, first published in French in 1944 and in English in 1965, has become a classic. It is both lucid and authoritative, by far the best overall account of this complex movement. Nadeau traces the evolution of surrealism, bringing to life its many internal debates about politics and art. He relates the movement to its intellectual and artistic environment, and he provides the statements and manifestos of Breton, Aragon, Zara, and others. I don't see any description for Herbert S. Gershman's The Surrealist Revolution in France. I'm not seeing any description for Towards the Poetics of Surrealism by J.H. Matthews. And I'm not seeing any description for Left-Wing Intellectuals Between the Wars, 1919 to 1939. Okay. Back to the text and footnote. In the cant of orthodox Marxism, these figures, Bloch, Morris, and Breton, are all charged with the same infractions, violating the code of science. The code adumbrated various subsections itemizing romantic, pessimistic, subjective, and utopian violations. For one Guardian, History and Class Consciousness by Lukács was, quote, the first major irruption of the romantic, anti-scientific tradition of bourgeois thought into Marxist theory, end quote. That quote is from Gareth Stedman Jones in the article The Marxism of the Early Lukács, published in New Left Review. Where the hell am I? That's from Gareth Stedman Jones. What the hell am I looking for? The Marxism of the Early Lukács. Not seeing any abstract for this piece. And Alvin Goldner's The Two Marxisms in his For Sociology. I'm not seeing any abstract for that article either. End footnote. The charge against the Frankfurt School runs, quote, in the place of revolutionary science enters bourgeois cultural pessimism, end quote. And that quote is from Heinrich von Heisler in Die Frankfurt-Schule in Lichte des Marxismus. I'm not seeing any description for that book. End footnote. Adorno and Horkheimer were accused of, quote, spiritualism, and Marcuse of, quote, petty bourgeois anarchism, end quote. A crime that is extended, quote, to all those who have taken him seriously, end quote. Footnote, Lucio Coletti, From Rousseau to Lenin. Wilhelm Reich and his followers did not escape the police raid, quote, your starting point is consumption, ours is production, therefore you are not Marxist, end quote. Cited by Reich in his What is Class Consciousness in Sexpol, Essays 1929-34. Edited by L. Baxendal. The description for Sexpol, Essays 1929-34 says, this volume contains the first complete translation of Wilhelm Reich's writings from his Marxist period. Reich, who died in 1957, had a career with a single goal, to find ways of relieving human suffering. And the same curiosity and courage that led him from medical school to join the early pioneers of Freudian psychoanalysis and then to some of the most controversial work of this century, Reich's development of the theory of the organ led him also at one point of his life to become a radical socialist. The renewed interest in Reich's Marxist writings, and particularly in his notions about sexual and political liberation, follows the radical critiques of Herbert Marcuse, Franz Fanon, and Paul Goodman, the political protest movement towards personal liberation in the present decade. That's from the Verso website. Back to the text. For other criticisms by the capital C communists, see Geschichte der deutschen Sexpol-Bewegung in an article published in Zeitschrift für politische Psychologie und Sexual Economy. See also Konstantin Sinelnikov, early, quote, Marxist critiques of Reich, published in 1972 in Telos. The abstract for this piece says, the views of the Russian and German communist critics opposed to Reich from 1929 to 33 may be summed up in a theoretical criticism of his article, Dialectical Materialism and Psychoanalysis, and in a political criticism of his theory of the necessity of proletarian sexual politics as a, quote, diversion from class struggle. Reich began his career as a psychoanalyst in Vienna and took an active part in the psychoanalytic clinic as soon as it opened in 1922. There he experienced the connections between neurosis and people's material and sexual life conditions, which were much more obvious in the lower classes than in private patients, and became convinced that one had to leave individual therapy for prophylaxis, that is, a practical struggle against the conditions of sexual misery carried out in the social and ideological field. And that was the abstract for early, quote, Marxist critiques of Reich by Konstantin Sinelnikov. Back to the text and footnote. The Surrealists were indicted for blocking capitalist development. Quote, it is necessary to affirm plainly that the movement that one could call technological, bracket, machiniste, and bracket, is destined to develop in the world in an irresistible fashion, ... Communists should be one of the principal factors in its development, end quote. Footnote, Pierre Neville, Les Révolutions et les Intellectuels. The description of this book, which translates as The Revolution and the Intellectuals, Better and Worse. What Can the Surrealists Do? It was published in 1975 by Pierre Neville. And the description says, From Breton to Trotsky, from Surrealism to Marxism. Is this path undertaken since 1924? By Pierre Neville. Intellectuals are in search of their social and poetic identity, or their erasure. Today is yesterday. From a confrontation with André Breton and Antonin Artaud to a polemic with Jean-Paul Sartre, Pierre Neville can conclude that in May 1968, in China of the, quote, proletarian culture revolution, end quote, in the East and the West shaken as never before, Marxist analysis and Surrealist vision implement virtues that are always young and for a long time. That's the description of the revolution and the intellectuals, better and worse. What can the Surrealists do? Seems like some of that stuff was added later to the book, since that book was originally published in 1926 and not in 1968. End footnote. Against the dirty words romanticism, subjectivism, aestheticism, utopianism, the clean words are invoked: science, objectivity, rigor, structure. Here the final, most psychological contours of orthodox Marxism come into view. Adorno's characterization of positivism as, quote, the puritanism of knowledge, end quote, is valid for orthodox Marxism. Footnote. See Adorno et al. In The Positivism Dispute in German Sociology. End footnote. The goal is rigorous self-control and self-discipline. The asceticism of orthodox Marxism despises unregulated insight as the threat. The sexual code is internalized as conceptual commandments. Suggestions of utopia and romanticism are tabooed as too suggestive. Scientific Marxism dreams not of a life without anxiety, but of master plans and inter-office memos. Structural Marxism not only examines but is in love with structure. It fears the unstructured. Asceticism is the conceptual center of gravity of orthodox Marxism. Concepts are multiplied so as to stamp out dissolute thought and thinkers. The object is to become an object, hence the hatred for the subjective. That the dissenters have been regularly derided as infantile, from Engels through Lenin, implies the psychosexual core. Authority is threatened. Footnote: the charge of infantilism can be found in Engels' rebukes to the, quote, Jungen, the opponents of the German social democratic orthodoxy. See Engels' Antwort an die Redaktion der Sächsischen Arbeiter-Zeitung, published in 1890, in Marx Engels Werke. See Dirk H. Müller's Idealism und Revolution, der Opposition der Jungen gegen den sozialdemokratischen Parteivorstand, in Hans M. Bach's Geschichte des linken Radikalismus in Deutschland. I'm not seeing anything for this book, Idealism und Revolution, by Dirk H. Müller. For this let's see if there's anything for this. I'm not seeing anything for Hans Manfred Bach's Geschichte des linken Radikalismus in Germany, in Deutschland. Ein Versuch. I think this book is pretty important. It's a reference point that a lot of people use when they're talking about the history of council communism. Anyway, end footnote. One critic is offended that nowhere in history and class consciousness is Marxism recognized as a, quote, real and responsible science, end quote. Again, Gareth Stedman Jones, The Marxism of the Early Lukács. The gun of science is unsheathed whenever thought thinks too much. Another critic growls that unless, quote, we, quote, move on from the discovery of the horrors of capitalism to an attempt to understand capitalism scientifically, end quote, we will be plagued by, quote, another 40 years of paralyzing virtuosity of the Frankfurt School, end quote. Goran Terborn, The Frankfurt School, New Left Review. End footnote. The threat of paralyzed virtuosity is met by preventative arrests and 5-year plans. Quote, their first concern, end quote, wrote Max Horkheimer about orthodox Marxism, quote, when they think about freedom is the new penal system, not its abolition, end quote. Horkheimer. The Authoritarian State. The Essential Frankfurt School Reader, edited by Arato and Gebhardt. End footnote. Not only Ben Franklin, but orthodox Marxism as well are infused with the spirit of Puritanism. The mental apparatus subordinates the mess of material desire to permanent press concepts. Orthodox Marxism ironically confirms what Mary Douglas called the, quote, purity rule, end quote. an increase in, quote, disemboweling and etherizing forms of expression, end quote, correspond to a tightened net of social domination. Wikipedia says Dame Mary Douglas was a British anthropologist known for her writings on human culture, symbolism, and risk, whose area of specialty was social anthropology. Douglas was considered a follower of Emile Durkheim and a proponent of structuralist analysis with a strong interest in comparative religion. Back to the text. Footnote. See Mary Douglas, Natural Symbols, published in 1973. Where am I? Wikipedia says Natural Symbols, Explorations in Cosmology is an influential book by British cultural anthropologist Mary Douglas. Further editions were published in 1973, 1982, 1996, 2003. It was also published in 2003 as Volume 3 in Mary Douglas Collected Works. It was in Natural Symbols that Douglas introduced the, quote, group grid theory, with, quote, group indicating how clearly defined an individual's social position is as inside or outside a bounded social group, and, quote, grid indicating how clearly defined an individual's social role is within networks of social privileges, claims, and obligations. The group grid pattern was later to be refined and redeployed in laying the foundations of the cultural theory of risk. Back to the text. I wanted to look up Douglas, purity, and danger. Wikipedia says Purity and Danger, an analysis of concepts of pollution and taboo, is a 1966 book by the anthropologist and cultural theorist Mary Douglas. Purity and Danger is her best-known work. In 1991, the Times Literary Supplement listed it as one of the 100 most influential nonfiction books published since 1945. The line of inquiry in Purity and Danger traces the words and meaning of dirt in different contexts. What is regarded as dirt in a given context is any matter considered out of place. Douglas took that lead from William James. Douglas attempted to clarify the differences between the sacred, the clean, and the unclean in different societies and times, but that did not entail judging religions as pessimistic or optimistic in their understanding of purity or dirt, such as dirt affirming or otherwise. Through a complex and sophisticated reading of ritual, religion, and lifestyle, Douglas challenged Western ideas of pollution and clarified how context and social history are essential. As an example of that approach, Douglas first proposed that the kosher laws were not, as many believed, either primitive health regulations or randomly chosen tests of the Israelites' commitment to God. Instead, Douglas argued that the laws were about symbolic boundary maintenance. Prohibited foods were those that did not seem to fall neatly into any category. For example, the place of pigs in the natural order was ambiguous, because pigs shared the cloven hoof of the ungulates, but did not chew cud. Later, in a 2002 preface to Purity and Danger, Douglas went on to retract this explanation of the kosher rules and said that it had been a, quote, major mistake. Instead, Douglas proposed that, quote, the dietary laws intricately model the body and alter upon one another, For instance, among land animals, Israelites were allowed to eat animals only if they were allowed to be sacrificed as well, animals that depend on herdsmen. Douglas concluded from that animals that are abominable to eat are not in fact impure, but that, quote, it is abominable to harm them, end quote. She claimed that later interpreters, even later biblical authors, had misunderstood this. A historian of late antiquity, Peter Brown, stated that purity and danger was a major influence in his important 1971 article, The Rise and Function of the Holy Man in Late Antiquity, which is considered to be one of the bases for all subsequent study of early Christian asceticism. In Powers of Horror, published in 1980, Julia Kristeva elaborates her theory of abjection and recognizes the influence of Douglas's, quote, fundamental work, but criticizes certain aspects of her approach. That's the Wikipedia for Purity and Danger by Mary Douglas. Back to the text and footnote. The dirty words of Marxism, humanism itself, recall the corporal and carnal reality that gives the lie to pristine theories of metastructures. As a cohort of Althusser put it, quote, I shall not be satisfied until I either situate it, bracket, the word man, in bracket, ... in the necessity of the theoretical system, ... or eliminate it as a foreign body, end quote. Balibar, in Reading Capital. I would have missed this revealing passage without E.P. Thompson's discussion of it in his Poverty of Theory. Back to the text. End footnote. The conformity of orthodox Marxism is a servant of the cold passion for science and authority. Althusser tells us that ideology belongs to the future as well as the past. Althusser means keep your uniforms. The logic of, quote, so much the worse for the facts, end quote, challenged the regulations that have domesticated Marxism. Nevertheless, the choices are not between facts and fantasy, conceptual rigor and free association, science and poetry, or optimism and pessimism. These are the bad choices that perpetuated Marxism as a caricature. The pieces do not fit neatly together, but neither does society. This suggests at least one guide for a critical Marxism. Do not lose the pieces. Do not lose the pieces. Well, that's the end of this piece. Thank you so much for listening.